Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley at Oxbow Advisors, and I'm so happy today, delighted to have my favorite demographic person and the person I think is the best person to look at demography in the country, um, Neil Howe. Neil was with us at our summit last year, and unfortunately, he can't be here this year, but we're happy to have him. And I want to mention to everyone, if you will try to finish the entire setting of this particular interview, I think what you'll find from Neil will really be enlightening for you. Besides looking at what's going on now, we talk a lot about what maybe we may be seeing in the future as well. So, Neil, welcome.
Thank you, Ted. It's great to be back virtually.
Yeah, and Neil has written 12 books or more. He's got another one coming out in 22. The one that I probably will mention more today, a little bit more, is The Fourth Turning. But Neil, before we get into it, you might give us just a sketch of how the age groups stack up right now in terms of the terms.
Well, one thing I like to look at is, a lot of people do demography, but one thing that makes my approach a little different is I look at generations, which is not just looking at age brackets, it's looking at different groups of people who have been had different experiences, shaped by different experiences in childhood, coming of age, and take those attitudes and behaviors with them as they move into older age brackets. So it gives us a predictive lens because we can already tell how that group is going to behave, right, as it moves into its next phase of life. And that's a sort of fundamental method that I've developed over many decades. Bill Strauss and I wrote our first book back in 1991 called Generations, The History of America's Future. And at that time, we would define generations in a way which are pretty familiar to most people today. We defined, the greatest generation, the GI generation, as people born in the first quarter of the 20th century, 1901 to 1924. Of course, there's only like 1.5 million left. I mean, there are not many left now. They represent all of these virtues, which we find it very difficult to imagine as Americans today. Community, progress, optimism. Where do you find that? They were, if you're a boomer, you remember GIs running the world when you were growing up as a kid and you came of age. I mean, GIs were running everything, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, although you might have said to a lot of boomers, too good a job, right? They had things too much in control. Anyway, that's the GI generation. The next generation is the silent generation, born 1925 to 1942. They're today in their very late 70s to early 90s. They're what we call, the dominant generation of seniors today, very well off financially. This generation has done better financially than any other generation in American history relative to the young. And you see today, you look at the Fed data, households age 75 plus have higher net worth than any younger age brackets. It's the first time it's happened in American history, and largely due to the very fortunate location. There's a great demand for their skills just after World War II when they started getting their jobs. A lot of them saved for their retirement starting in the early 80s. Now, if you can imagine starting your investment program in the early 80s, Ted, just think how well you would have done over the next 30 years, right? Bonds, stocks, it doesn't matter. You just had the greatest bull market in America. Their last cohort, born in 1942, reached age 65 in 2007. Perfect timing, right? Cash out, let everything else go to hell, and then have a very friendly Fed chairman who's going to keep interest rates low, keep your asset prices high. Anyway, they've done very well. And there's a lot of guilt, actually, in that group about how their children and grandchildren, their boomer and Xer children and their millennial grandchildren are doing, and not being able to have the same location and history that they had. Boomers, we define as born 1943 to 1960. A couple of years earlier than the Census Bureau defines them. But this is, we all know about them, right? They were the beaver cleavers of the 50s. They came of age as screaming, long-haired radicals and Vietnam grunts, inner-city rioters in the late 60s and 70s. And they gave America its fifth great awakening, huge redefinition of the culture and values. And we find this a very interesting pattern in American history, which recurs. Now, boomers today still kind of run America. They're in our top leadership positions. We obviously have a boomer president. Boomers are still, leadership positions in many leadership positions in Congress and governors. And then the generation after them, born 1961 to 1981. So basically, if you're born in the 60s and 70s, you're a Gen Xer. And the boomers still had a protected upbringing. The Gen Xers were throwaway kids. I mean, that's back, they were the children of the awakening. No one wanted to have kids. And in fact, their first name was baby bust generation, because there weren't many of them. The fertility rate plummeted in the early 1960s. Divorce revolution, schools no longer seemed to work. People didn't want to have kids. And so we had all these childless double horror movies, like Rosemary's Baby. Anyway, no one wanted to have kids. And so they learned to raise themselves. So one thing we associate with Gen X is a great deal of individual resilience. Gen Xers are the preeminent free agency generation. They take care of themselves. They don't expect anything from government. They don't expect anything from, other people. So the resilience is really a strength of that generation. Not so much a generation of vision and values like the boomers. This is a pragmatic generation. And the first wave of Xers born in the 1960s are actually a very Republican generation. They came of age with Ronald Reagan, and many of them were permanently influenced by that experience. The next generation, born starting in 1982, probably ending around 2003, 2004, is the Millennial generation. And millennials were suddenly much more protectively raised. You see that again, pattern from underprotection to overprotection of children. Millennials were protectively raised. They were, all the child safety gadgets when they were kids. Suddenly the movies about kids were all very upbeat and cuddly, and a much more structured upbringing. One thing we associate with millennials is much less risk-taking. There's a much more risk-averse generation than Gen Xers were. They want structure. They want protection. They want institutions that protected them just as their parents protected them. And they're expecting this from government. And we find that millennials are voting heavily for the Democratic Party, because the Democrats, at least nominally, claim to be the party of community, right? And they want community and structure. So that's where we are today. And of course, millennials are still coming of age. So those are the generations. Now, historically, what we find is that these generations fall into archetypes, meaning each of these generations has a type like them in the past. The generations like millennials actually was the GI generation, which was also very protectively raised, during the progressive era when we had all these childless labor laws and we kept drugs and alcohol away from kids. They were raised in very much the same way. The prototype for Gen X would have been the lost generation, who put the roar into the roaring 20s. A very wild generation, tended to vote very Republican, by the way. They were the ones who did not vote for FDR during the 1930s. And they didn't really want government benefits when they were old. It was the GI generation that became the senior citizen, right, who really wanted Social Security and government to take care of them, because FDR promised, right, the government would take care of them. And by gosh, they were going to make sure that that government guarantee came through. So we see these echoes. Now, as each of these generations comes of age, and as they all get older, they take society through recurring, what we call turnings, or moods of history. And these moods of history, Ted, explain some of the big patterns we see, the macro patterns we see in American history. One of the most interesting is this. If you go back over the last 5 centuries of sort of Anglo-American experience, going back to the early colonies, you find we have these huge civic upheavals, this complete, redefinition and rebirth of American life, publicly, civically, economically, about once every long human life. About 80 to 90 years we have it. We had it in the Glorious Revolution and the War of Spanish Succession, an enormous global war that happened from the 1690s, right around 1700. Then we had the American Revolution. Then we had the Civil War. Then we had the Great Depression, World War II. And guess what? here we are again, same location in history. And roughly halfway in between these great public traumas, we have the great awakenings in American history. In these awakenings, we don't rebuild the outer world of institutions and infrastructure. We rebuild the inner world of values, culture, religion in particular. And of course, the most recent one we had like that was the late 60s and 70s. That's when boomers are coming of age. And we've had those repeatedly earlier as well. So these give structure to history. And each of those generations, so a generation as it's being shaped by history, later on, about 40 years later, as parents and midlife leaders, they shape history and therefore shape the next generation. So you see, it's a cycle, right? And what we see in this broadly recurring cycle, and we predicted this back in the late 1990s, that America, starting sometime around 2005, 2006, something like that, would enter a new turning, a new generation-long era of civic crisis. That's these big crisis areas. That's going to be like, the 30s and early 40s. It's going to be like the 1860s. I mean, we're talking about nation redefining eras. And that's what we're in right now, Ted. And these are the turnings. I mean, we can go and talk individually about the turnings if you like, or we can talk about, where we are in them.
Well, Neil, in one of the things, and I'll tell people this, one of Neil's books, his latest book, was a book called The Fourth Turning, which is this particular time period we're in right now. And I think this is why Neil's work is so interesting. And a lot of people try to copy it, but nobody's as good as Neil. And one of the things that happened, I think in these fourth turnings, interesting. You talk about the chaos of what's going on in the world. One of probably the biggest. There's two or three big questions, but one of the biggest ones today that we see from investors and just people in general is, I don't really feel comfortable. I don't even know what's going on. I don't even know if I recognize the U.S. right now. Can you talk about that a little bit in the fourth turning?
Yeah, I think history begins to move really fast in the fourth turning, and I think that's what people are understanding. One thing you have to remember is back in the late 80s, certainly 1990s, early 00s, not much happened publicly in America. I think back in the 1990s, what happened? Well, maybe the Soviet Union fell apart right at the beginning of the decade. But what happened domestically in America, publicly, during that decade? I mean, I don't know. A lot of celebrity stuff, I guess the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, you start thinking about stuff, right? But nothing fundamentally comes to mind. And so here's my first observation, looking at history. History does not move at a uniform speed. I think it was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He had a great quote, and he should have known. He was there when history moved very fast, but he said, sometimes decades happen in which nothing, sometimes decades pass in which nothing happens. And sometimes months pass in which decades happen. And we're entering a period in which in a short time, public history is going to move very fast. Now, that doesn't mean, underlying, our basic underlying family and social patterns are going to change very rapidly. In fact, this may sound, this may sound a little bit counterintuitive, Ted, but I would say when it comes to family life, we're actually more traditional than we are. We're actually rediscovering ourselves in our family unit. I would say the last 15 years has seen a rebirth in the extended families in America. I watch real estate patterns and I see there are more and more adults living together per household today. And young people are coming back to live with their families, and they're doing so largely on an amicable basis. They get along well. I know even when they're not living together, boomers and their millennial kids, they're calling each other every day. They're looking after themselves, unlike young boomers ever did with their own parents. A very different kind of relationship. I think actually in many of our ordinary family values and at a basic level in our society, we're becoming very conventional. We're actually going back, I told you, millennials being risk averse. They don't want to take personal risks. They actually want to stay near institutions and little tribes that are going to protect them. But in our overall political life, that's going to move very fast. And I think you see one I think this whole turning, this fourth turning started with the GFC in 2008, 2009. It's going to last a good 22 years, the length of a whole generation. So it's going to go on now till the year 2030. So we have a good decade to go of this, right? So we're just beginning to accelerate. But I think one thing we saw with this,
let me ask you on that. You would be, I'm assuming you're expecting a lot of change ahead too in that next 10 years.
Yes, we're going to see a lot more change than we've seen thus far. So this is an accelerating process. This is true of most fourth turnings. It's hard to tell about the timing of the fourth turnings. Obviously, history is very contingent. Things can move at different speeds at different times. Basically, a fourth turning always starts with the catalyst, something that suddenly convinces everyone that we've suddenly changed gears. I think the catalyst this most recent fourth turning was the GFC, 2008, 2009, huge changes in public attitudes toward equality, toward globalization.
For those who don't know, that's the great financial collapse.
Yeah, the great financial crisis,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
And the very long recovery, and I think it's been further accentuated, obviously, with this pandemic lockdown of 2020. And we look, I mean, just a year ago in 2019, everyone was making fun of Bernie Sanders for socialism. Well, we're all socialists now. We're all wards of the state. I mean, everyone's on some sort of PPP or unemployment stimulus. I mean, we are going to, many months of this year, Ted, we're going to be borrowing more money than the federal government's actually receiving in tax revenue. I mean, how often does that happen? We are going to have a higher level of publicly held debt as a share of GDP by the end of next year than we did at the end of World War II. And we didn't even have a war yet. I should say yet. So these are uncharted waters for us. And I think we're moving into a new era of fiscal policy, a new era of monetary policy. I see whole new problems on the horizon when it comes to economic management. In particular, and let's just get there, I think it's a good move. We're talking about economic rifts of the fourth turning. And that is, we've seen in the last 15 years, and one of the reasons why America is kind of in this mood to change things, they're extremely dissatisfied where America's going today. And I think you can see everyone's dissatisfied. It doesn't matter whether you're blue zone or red zone. No one likes where America's going today, right? Our business dynamism is declining. Our inequality is rising. We see the big incumbent companies taking more and more, pricing power and market share. And this pandemic has even made it worse, wiping out all the small businesses. But obviously, I mean, just look at the S&P, right? Some of the big giants are still doing great. So I think the point is that everyone wants to change the trend. And among the trends, I think, that you'll see, and this is partly a generational trend, is this huge tilt of the economy toward those who are more affluent and older. I talked about the silent generation, how well they're doing, and people who have assets. But how about millennials? When are they going to get a chance to buy into the S&P at half its current value? Well, the Fed is going to prevent that ever from happening, right? He's going to make sure that everyone who has assets, make sure they get their full value. So I think one of the things we're going to see is, in the result of this, is efforts to actually tilt the economy back to give more opportunities and better prices, that's say, for buying assets to younger people. And one way that will happen, I think, is going to be inflation. I mean, inflation is the one way the government can get out from under all those fixed dollar liabilities, right? And this is something I wouldn't have said after the global financial crisis, but I will say it now. I think that Jerome Powell's nailed the yield curve to the floor for the next 2 years. At least he's promising to. So money is free. So why not just print as much as you want? Fed will monetize it, give it to everyone, and I guarantee you can engineer inflation in this country. I don't think this is a near-term risk, but I think medium and long-term, and I think you already see the signs of what's happening to the dollar, precious metals. I think you already see some of the leading indicators Well, that already is something to prepare for, right? Something at least.
I might ask you on that because you know this history better than anybody. But if you look at debt to GDP in World War II, where it was, 105% or whatever, it took 40 years to get that back to 25 or 30% of GDP. And we keep saying it was because you were inflating a little bit more than you were making.
Well, initially, yeah, you're right. It was partly doing. Now, initially, we did it. We ran surpluses. We in the late 40s, early 50s, we actually ran surpluses. Believe it or not, it's unbelievable, but we ran surpluses. So partly we did the honest thing early on, and later on, it is true. The late 60s and 70s, there's no question we inflated our way out of it. I mean, a lot of those long-term treasuries are still fixed at 4%. We got inflation up there in the double digits. You're going to run ahead of that pretty fast.
But can you imagine at all today what would happen if we decided to run a surplus in terms of just the social upheaval from?
Oh my God, you're absolutely right, and I think, but anyway, but the reshuffling of the deck, right, to restructure the economy to give more people opportunities they don't now have. I think that's just going to be inevitable. And by the way, that happened in a big way during the 1930s and 40s. Here's what a lot of people don't understand about the GI generation. Today boomers like to look back and they think, they're the greatest generation. They won all these wars and everything, which is true. They did all those things, and it was incredible, right? How much they built. Back then, by the way, government for the GIs was not primarily about giving people cash and giving people entitlements. It was pouring concrete. It was building things. I mean, they built dams, they built harbors, they built bridges, they built missiles, they built stuff. They didn't primarily redistribute. So that's point number one. But point number two was, this is an overwhelmingly democratic generation. And they came of age with the New Deal. And the New Deal promised open up America, right, to a new class that had been disenfranchised. And they were a huge union generation. They were the larger share of the GI generation belonged to unions than any other generation in American history. And they actually reduced income and wealth inequality in America over their lifetime. Hugely went down in the 30s and the 40s. It reached its lowest point ever just when they were retiring in the late 1960s. So then the silent generation, the boomers took over, and guess what? It all went the other way after they retired. So the GIs truly believed in a very collegial model of cooperation and teamwork. And I think that's what we miss about the GIs, by the way. And I'm not talking even about so much their economic policies. I'm just talking about that sense of national teamwork, right? That sense of civic republicanism that we used to have. We're all in this together.
And you don't see that now. And I was going to ask you about that. We're, as far as I know, at least in my working career, we're at a peak in income inequality. I've often said that that's one of my big problems with Wall Street, really, is that we keep getting that, and it's egregious now to the point where it's really sort of sickening. Do you see that subsiding or going the other way during this turning period over the next 10 years?
No, I see that becoming a bigger issue. I see, that's going to be right. That's going to rise itself in the guise of antitrust, tax policy, and industrial policy. I mean, I see all those things coming. The main impact of the Green New Deal, you hear, AOC and some of these, the left wing of the Democrats in Congress talk about the Green New Deal. In my opinion, in the context of the fourth turning, it's less about environmentalism and future climate and more just about social mobilization. I think there's a great undercurrent in America in favor of simply mobilizing society to do something together. And by the way, I mean, one of the things I think we're going to see over this next, what's remaining of the fourth turning, and that will go on, by the way, into the next turning, is a huge new emphasis on public infrastructure in this country. We're still living, I talked earlier about the GIs pouring all that concrete. We're still living with the stuff that they poured. We haven't rebuilt any of it. I mean, it's just still sitting there, right? And so if you want to know the greatest need in America, over the next 10 years, even over the next 20 years, it's going to be rebuilding all that stuff with new technologies, using all the smart digital technologies. But we're going to see a huge emphasis on rebuilding our public space. We spend so much of our energy designing better and better individualistic consumer products, right? That's what all tech does. More for you, just for you, not for anyone else, right? Everything's for each individual. I think you're going to see a huge new emphasis on technology for public purposes. And a lot of boomers today, we remember as kids being surrounded by this wonderful technology built for everyone. In fact, a lot of boomers went to colleges that were completely paid for, by states. We didn't have to pay hardly anything, right? Well, that was socialized back then, but for today's kids, we privatize it, right? So this is a little bit of the generational imbalance, I think, that millennials are feeling.
And so in the past fourth turnings, if you look at like the types of investments that fared well, or what an individual or even an institutional investor would be looking at over that next 10-year period, I know not in getting in, you can't get into tiny specifics, but generally in the fourth turnings, what's worked well in those turnings?
Well, I think we're already started to talk about it. Stuff which actually rebuilds the real world. So we're talking about, in terms of sectors, we're talking about materials and industry. We're talking about those kinds of things. You think about enormous new infrastructure in America. Which companies are going to be involved with that? Who's going to be recruited? And by the way, we haven't even talked about defense. Remember, fourth turnings also tend to involve confrontations abroad. They usually tend to involve some sort of, geopolitical conflict, or sometimes in the case of the Civil War, internal conflict. But in either cases, you mobilize for that as well. So it's going to be less thinking about industries which cater to specialized services for individuals, and much more of the kind we've just been talking about. So I see that as one big emphasis. And I think the other emphasis we talked about earlier, stay away from products that are denominated in nominal dollars.
Yes, it can't adjust to inflation.
Right, exactly. So if you really want long-term bonds, you want some kind of long-term fixed income. Think about tips, by the way, which are already been benefiting as people look ahead to this new environment. I think they're going to benefit even more.
I know we have a position in tips, and for everybody out there, Treasury inflated securities that adjust. But the other side of that is if you look at the 70s, when you had a lot of inflation, the markets did nothing. And you could make money, but you had to know strategically where you were. At times you had to have more cash than other times. Do you see that returning?
Yeah, well, I certainly see economic uncertainty returning. I mean, just think of the late 30s. It went up and down hugely. We had 30s are just a terrible time for the economy, but we actually had from 1932 to 1936, we actually had this huge recovery. Year over year, we had enormous GDP gains. Then it collapsed again in 1937. And I think most Americans' impression is that on the eve of Pearl Harbor, which was December 1941, most Americans look back and they said, our country has done nothing. In the last 11 years, we've gone nowhere. We basically let things fall apart. I mean, so there was a great sense of despair in America, but it was not just the overall direction. It was nothing. It was also a tremendous amount of volatility and uncertainty, both in production and financial.
It took the markets from 29 to early 50s to?
Yeah, to recap. And again, I mean, imagine that was nominal. So we can imagine that.
Right.
Inflation-adjusted dollars. It took someone longer. So, and there was talk at the end of World War II and going into the boom unexpectedly, which started in 1946. Everyone initially thought there was going to be a huge recession after World War II, as there often was, and there was a little bit of a recession in the late 40s, but we largely avoided that. But there was talk by many economists who were very impressed by all this new national planning and, social welfareism and the so-called success of the Soviet model, which had which had helped to defeat Hitler, there was talk about just getting rid of financial markets. I mean, believe it or not, there were people who were thinking maybe we really didn't. Maybe this is an irrational. Well, by the time we reached the affluent society of the late 50s, no one was talking like that anymore. But there was this period right after this era of total war, total national mobilization, where people were actually thinking, maybe markets was a frivolous luxury we no longer needed.
And I if I remember correctly, maybe I'm missing this, I don't think so. You mentioned that in a lot of the forthturning saving, did you say that if a person was looking ahead, they typically had a bit more savings, they started to look out for themselves a little more? Did I read that right?
Yeah, well, the savings rate certainly goes up. It's certainly been going up this year. There's nothing that increases, personal savings rate like uncertainty, radical uncertainty. And I think also, more importantly, the whole country's idea of preparing for the future begins to increase. One of the great ironies of fourth turnings, when you think about it, is you think in the middle of a crisis, why are you thinking about long term, right? So that's the last time you'd want to think about long term stuff, right? A crisis. You got to just think about the short term stuff. But isn't it amazing that some of our most far-sighted projects in terms of planning and infrastructure have come during crises? It was during World War II they were actually already planning, the IMF and the World Bank and the exchange standard and investing in the Marshall Plan and doing and hugely preparing for an enormous rush of infrastructure investment. It was during the Civil War that we actually passed the Homestead Act and we decided to actually start the Intercontinental Railroad, and we went ahead with these plans. I think one interesting lesson about history, and this is again counterintuitive, is that it's actually during a time of crisis when we finally come together as a country and we actually finally decide to make long-term decisions that we should have made when we had the luxury and time, but we never would have made. You understand?
And let me ask you this, Neil. If you look at the industry today, and I know the firm you're with and everything, and you've had your own company, you've done everything, but if you look at the financial investment industry today, and I've said this a number of times, we have a lot of people in the industry that don't know how to operate in bad times, in tough times. They haven't been through any, and so it's sort of a plug and play like mentality right now. And we kept saying all along at Oxbow that, hey, there's going to be a period in here where you better have some knowledge of what's happening.
No, I totally agree. And look, the whole ETF trend, right? Everyone get, the passive investing and just, hopping on an index until there are no more discretionary investors out there to keep anyone safe. It becomes like lemmings all rushing over the cliff ultimately. And who's going to stop that? I think there's a particular problem for millennials. You think about millennials, a lot of millennials take the attitude, I think we all take this attitude to some extent. I think millennials take it more than other generations, and that is, I don't mind getting behind. I don't mind losing so long as everyone else is losing with me. And I remember during the great booms that I've seen in my life, the late 1990s or just before the GFC, a lot of people said, I don't think I should invest, but I can't stand the idea of my neighbor getting out ahead of me. I'd rather, if we all went down together, I'd be fine, but I just can't stand. So, and this is another thing to remember about wealth and income. It's not just absolute level. We're all humans. We're all social animals. So a lot of income and wealth is positional, right? A lot of our feeling of satisfaction is how we're doing relative to other people. This is something that economists classically miss about human behavior.
And, on that note, with the boomers, for example, they always compare to the others. Like, I want to make more money than the other boomer, or I don't want to lose as much. So I can say at the dinner table, hey, everybody, I'm XY, I own this, and it's doing better than everybody else. They have that mentality like that.
Yeah, they do. Although I will say that you do have boomers who will say, I made all the money I need. That's it. I don't really care what anyone thinks of me. I'll just go out and do what I want with it. You know what I mean? There is that kind of asocial. I'm going to go, I'll just take all my money and go into a monastery, or who knows what I might do. I think boomers are happy living on the one house on the top of a mountain somewhere, having no neighbors. But I think millennials are both more risk averse, and they really want something that protects them all together. I think boomers were okay. Remember, one of the great boomer fears when they were coming of age, back in the late 60s and 70s, is they thought the middle class was terrible. The middle class is too powerful. Remember, our boomer parents did too good a job at equalizing America and creating this very powerful middle class. And boomers hated middle class. You talk to millennials today, they say, where is the middle class? I want to join it. Where can I go? And I love the idea of a middle class. How can I get there? But you see, that's what's interesting about generations, Ted. The same age bracket, very different attitudes. And that's the impact of different generations occupying those age brackets. So I'll give you another contrast, which I find equally powerful. During the pandemic, millennials have been more in favor than any older age bracket of a strict national policy of containment. That means to say, at a national level, we have a policy. Everyone strictly is required to enforce it. We actually do containment. We do track and trace. We do all that stuff. We actually follow best procedures and so on. It's Xers and millennials are saying, no, don't tread on me. I got my rights. I can do whatever I want. No one's going to tell me what to do. So, and it's interesting, isn't it, Ted? And by the way, it argues totally against the self-interest of those generations, right? Millennials have the most to lose by containment and lockdown economically, and they have the least to fear from the infection. Boomers is the opposite way. But anyway, that doesn't explain how they're reacting. But let me say, if you had gone back to the late 70s, so let's just pretend the pandemic had hit in 1975, okay? How would the GI generation in midlife have responded? Everyone get on your uniforms. We're going to have a national policy from that. That's how the older generation would have responded, right? We go into military mode. We've done it before. We'll do it again. And what would young boomers have been saying? Hell no, I'm not going to put on those things. You see my point? Same age bracket, different attitudes. Why? Different generations. So my point is, you've got to follow the generation forward and understand why they're different to be able to predict the future.
So Neil, I have two closeout questions for you.
All right.
One is, let's say that I'm one of those 40, 50, 60-year-olds that has a liquidity event today, and I have liquid money, okay, and I have to think about the next 10 years. What do you think that investment how should that look to that person? Because it's a different time than it would have been 20, 30 years ago. So just sort of a thought process on that.
Look, all the classic rules, diversification. I also would not separate it from other things you should be doing in your personal life. I mean, a lot of things I tell people in that phase of life, know where your family is. No, just literally, physically, geographically, where are they? Are you going to count on them? A lot of what people want to do through, market transactions like, long-term care and be cared for and everything. Everyone knows that ultimately it's going to be your family, it's going to be friends, it's going to be non-market stuff that's really going to matter. And in a fourth turning, these services may not be available. You know what I mean? So I think it's just the context of your time you have to think about. Know where your family is, know where community is, because there are going to be people helping you in a fourth turning. And then finally, when it comes to your actual money, diversification is the rule, right? There's going to be crazy volatility all over the world. You don't want to be caught. I mean, this is the classic case of not having your eggs in one basket. Stay away from ETFs in one national market, right? In fact, just stay away from ETFs together, at least equity ETFs. My other rule, just two more rules. Get out of nominal assets. We talked about that earlier, right? This is not the time to be in something that has a fixed dollar value. Right, because I think the upside potential for inflation is large. And then finally, when you're thinking about industries, go back to what I said about industries and materials and just manufacturing and materials. I just think what's going to be rewarded over the past 10 or 20 years is going to be more community goods than individual goods. And a lot of those community goods, we already know this is coming, is rebuilding the outer world, which hasn't been built since the GI generation built it, right?
And the other thing, Neil, that would come out in that, and I think we're starting to see the signs of that. I know we at Oxbow have pushed that direction a bit in that you have a whole group of people here that have really never seen inflation. So they don't know what it looks like, and so they won't know how to deal with it. And they have this tremendous trust in the bond market right now, while they're getting nothing, by the way. And so, it makes for an interesting time over the next 10 years.
Well, we're not, yeah, and I would say this, look, I don't think we're going to have negative interest rates in America. I just think it's too difficult. I think in Europe you can do it because they find a way to subsidize the banks to actually, carry the charge of the negative. I mean, it's devastating to banks unless you have a very extensive sort of subsidization of the bank. I don't think we're going to do it in America. And what that means is there's not really a lot of upside left, right? I mean, if you're not going to go negative, what's the upside?
There is none, and that's what we think too. That's why we have very, very short maturities. One last question for you.
Yeah.
And I know you can see this as well as anybody I've ever seen. You have the ability to be very apolitical, economic, everything. You can go down the middle of the road. And I'm asking this question about, so what do you see on the outcome on the other side? Are you positive about that on the awakening?
I'm hugely positive. We won't have an awakening. We're actually going to have a high, which is a post-crisis, or it's going to be like the late 40s, 50s, early 60s. It's going to be a whole generation. And it's going to be this generation coming after the millennials, today's homeland generation. These are kids up through about middle school today, right? They're coming after millennials, and they're going to be coming of age in this post-crisis era. What's their archetype? What are they going to be like? They're going to be like the silent generation. They're going to be very well behaved. They're going to have long-term plans. They're going to be kind of conformist. They're going to be pretty risk-averse, like the silent generation, like Joe Biden's generation. And they will do very well. They're being very protectively raised by these exer parents who themselves were throwaway kids, right? So that's another interesting pattern. As parents, we tend to raise our kids the opposite of how we were raised. So they're going to do very well, and they're going to give the kind of stability and a little bit of the conformity to this post-crisis era. And I think everyone's going to welcome that very much. And I think, by the way, just in your larger point, I'm very optimistic about America's future. When I look today at the future, the worst future I can imagine is a continuation of current trends. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way, right? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the young get disenfranchised. America has no future. There's greater distrust than ever in where our system's going. That, to me, is the true nightmare. Fourth turnings are history's way of renewing our society and actually being reborn. It's how we become young again politically. And we actually can formulate new agendas, new projects, come together again as a community and actually hope for a golden age, right? Golden ages come after crises, and that's what we're looking at.
Well, Neil, as usual, every time I've ever been and seen you give a speech, everybody says, gosh, I could have listened to him for 4 or 5 hours. He has so much information, which you really do have a lot of information. And for all those that are interested, you'll see a banner here that has Neil's contact information if you want to take his service. He writes some of the most interesting pieces almost every week. And I would encourage you to certainly take a look at it. Follow Neil. He has a new book coming out, right, in 22.
Yeah.
That should be interesting as well. And Neil, we really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Ted. This was very enjoyable. Thanks.
All the best. Thanks a lot.